Just to introduce you to our studio, we're an architecture and research practice based in Buffalo, New York. And in our work, especially in some of our recent work, we're interested in developing visible spatial ways to confront ecological conditions that I think of as challenges. And our position is that we see these challenges not as limitations, but rather as instigators for creative practice and for bringing awareness to these issues. As Fred mentioned, I'm also a faculty member at the University of Buffalo, State University of New York, in the School of Architecture and Planning, and you'll see that there's a tie between the teaching and the research that I do at the school and the kind of work that we're doing in our practice. So let's see. So recently, I've become preoccupied with what I think of as conflicted perceptions of urban wildlife, and especially this idea of the urban pest. So I would argue that within current discourses of sustainable design, that the ecosystemic role of animals is marginalized. And while we can see legal regulations mentioning animals, in architectural conversations, they're typically on the fringe. So we're interested in seeing how architecture can enter this picture and move the consideration of animals beyond the scope of urban regulations and toward agendas of aesthetics, space, environmental performance, and even ethics. So where do we see animals in cities? We know, for example, that the condition of habitat loss in cities and in urban environments is not new. We've known for quite some time that processes of urbanization have been rapidly depleting our cities of biodiversity. Today, we see many examples of places that are trying to counter these effects by to increase biodiversity by implementing wildlife corridors and nature reserves. And so, for example, this is a place near my hometown in Orange County, California, called the Bolsa Chica Ecological Reserve, which is a site that was formerly used for oil drilling and other purposes and is now constructed wetlands. And now it's the location for many species of bats and, birds and other aquatic life. But despite our ambitions, we see other attitudes emerge when nature takes over cities in unintended ways. So consider, for example, urban areas that lack regular maintenance, such as lawn mowing, and this is a typical scene from a post-industrial city like Buffalo. In fact, this is in Buffalo. Also think of, for example, vacant houses and unmaintained properties. These are areas that are teeming with wildlife. Dilapidated buildings. These are all from Buffalo, where walls are crumbling. So this is a biologist that I've been working with, and she's kind of hunting around looking for signs of wildlife. So these are kind of ideal habitat situations, but it could be argued that these aren't really seen as ideal forms of nature. Instead, these are seen as examples of urban blight. So this conflict of attitude, I think, can be traced to the way we consider the presence of animals and nature in cities. So on the one hand, we have examples like this, bird houses. We see birds as desirable creatures, but what happens when we see something like this, when wildlife encroaches upon more densely populated areas of cities? And we see this perception of the nuisance in the artifacts that we construct for these animals. So just think, for example, in the realm of birds, there's these ubiquitous wildlife deterrents, such as these spikes, and then also, I'm sure everyone's familiar with bird prevention nets. Recently, I've become very interested in bats, and this is because more than birds, bats face very difficult circumstances. They're critical to our ecosystem. You probably know that they serve as pollinators and pesticides, but for the most part, I think their role in our lives is underestimated. So currently, bats are dying off in great numbers due to white nose syndrome, which is a condition where white fungus develops on the nose of the bats, and it essentially kills them. So they're dying off due to this. It's a great epidemic that started in the northeastern United States in 2006, and it's quickly spreading westward. But this is something that I think is hardly on the public radar. So bats tend to get a bad rap, as you all know from popular media. So consider movies like Dracula, and this is the storyboards for Vampire Bats by an artist, Jeff Wall. And perhaps because of this reputation, one could argue that their presence in cities is intentionally diminished. So while there are examples of large bat houses in different places, like the ones from the 1920s by Charles Campbell and different examples, I would say that the artifacts that are typically constructed for bats tend to blend into the background. And bat houses, like the ones shown here, tend to either look like existing house components or they're kind of unremarkable in character. And these are bat houses in Buffalo. There's also building components, such as bat bricks, which are quite interesting, but at the same time, it's a building component where it's a brick where a bat could inhabit the inside of it, as you can see. But as you can see from the kind of lower image here, again, it's kind of inserted within the wall and again, blending into the background. So given these conflicting attitudes and logics, so on the one hand, recognizing animals as beneficial, and on the other hand, showing our repulsion toward some of them, I'm interested in how we as architects can develop strategies for incorporating diverse habitats into the built environment. And also thinking about how we can shift public opinion away from the idea of urban wildlife as a pest and toward thinking about a new kind of biodiversity. So the first strategy in our work as a practice is to visually intensify the presence of animals and other so-called pests by developing habitat conditions that also give them a spatial and tactile presence. So for example, here's a speculative project that we've called Pest Wall, where we're asking how can a wall not only act as a facade, but also as a membrane that prominently incorporates conditions for bat habitation. Could one also, for example, rethink the notion of the vernacular house? And certainly, and this is another version of Pest Wall, the idea of seeing a multi-story wall covered with animals, bats and birds, et cetera, would certainly provoke us to confront our conflicted attitudes toward urban wildlife. But despite these ambitions, I would say that it was difficult to get started with this agenda, and especially in an urban environment. And so to begin realizing an architectural campaign for wildlife advocacy, we began in a park, which is a place where people might more readily accept the notion of animals as part of our world. So the installation shown here is Bat Tower, built in 2010, and it's the first of a series of small-scale constructed interventions. And from our research, we found that several species of bats in the Northeast tend to inhabit small spaces within covered areas, and they can enter through very small spaces that are, half an inch wide. And bat houses, kind of traditional bat houses and bat roofs also tend to incorporate these small slotted spaces. So the tectonic agenda of this project was to kind of create a lot of crevices and slotted spaces. On the exterior, we incorporated protruding fins and, let's see, this thing works. Yeah. We incorporate these protruding fins, which would be locations for bats to land. And then there's also, as you can see, grooved surfaces, which act as almost like ladders for bats to climb. The interior is like a vertical cave, and it's formed by a series of thin crevices that would also support bat habitation. This is from the top looking down. The intention of this project was also to create a warm thermal environment. This is the images on the right are from a thermal camera looking up toward the top, and the strategy here was to use dark colored wood at the top that would absorb sunlight, making the top of the tower where bat inhabitation happened warmer than the bottom part. So the base is we designed it as a wide and heavy base that would not only stabilize the structure, but it would also function as a planter for vegetation and herbs that we were hoping would attract insects that would then attract bats. Now, due to the unique form of the project, we ended up with over 400 pieces of wood. And so to keep track of the pieces, rather than labeling the pieces with numbers and such, as you're all probably familiar with when you're CNC milling something. We decided to go with a Braille labeling system. And so what you're looking at is Braille and for a kind of system for labeling these pieces. And it's interesting how everyone had this Braille cheat sheet as they were making the project. And this was something that became visible in the exterior of the project as a way of kind of patterning the exterior. So this project was developed first as a prototype, and initially we didn't really even have a site to work with. So the tower was conceived of as a series of modules that could be transported and stacked with relative ease, since we didn't really know where the site was going to be. And there were a few false starts in more urbanized areas of Buffalo, but finally an organization that was willing to work with us was the Griffith Sculpture Park, located in a town outside of Buffalo, managed by the Ashford Hollow Foundation. And the site itself ended up posing a kind of large challenge because we, in the end, had to move all these heavy pieces up a generally unpaved muddy hill. But I think due to the flexibility of the system and the modularity of it, it really took our installation team only a couple of days to install the Bat Tower on the site. So the overall form and scale of the installation stands in contrast to the typical tactics that you might see in typical bat house construction, as I was mentioning earlier. So rather than blending into the background, this tower, I think, asserts itself in the landscape as a sizable presence. And from afar, it appears like a pristine sculpture, but if you get up close, and also over time, you can sense the messy evidence of life. There's bats emerging at dusk sometimes, you see spider webs, there's insects taking over, droppings, plant growth, stuff all over the bottom of the piece. And since everyone always asks, whenever I give a talk about this project, there's always a question whether or not bats are living in it. And yes, bats have been spotted in the tower in the summers. I've seen a few of them myself, and also my collaborators, including a biologist, has seen them. But this is something that we see only in the summer. I'll talk about this a little bit later on. So the next project that I'll talk about is called Habitat Wall. Following the Bat Tower, we initiated several other small projects in attempts to tackle similar issues. So this project is a large wall that's being installed on the side of an existing shed building at the Audubon Society Center in Buffalo. And what you're looking at here is a model that I built that I was working on while I was in residence at the McDowell Colony when I first began developing this project. And as you can see, it's comprised of a series of bays, these bays here. And between the structures hitting the ground, there's these kind of areas which are zones for bat and bird habitation. So here's some studies showing one particular bay of the wall design, and you can see closer up some of those crevices that you remember before for bat habitation, and as well as bird spaces above here, kind of birdhouse-like thing with a hole and this kind of cliff-like space. Currently, this project is under construction. There's a few of these modules done. I've turned the photo on the side so you can start to get a sense of what it might start looking like in real life. And another kind of tectonic idea of this project was to use recycled materials and building components such as the window shutters that you see here. And so the window shutters are from a place called Buffalo Reuse, which is an organization that takes excess or unwanted building materials, either from building demolitions or people renovating their houses, et cetera, and they'll sell them at a much, much cheaper price to the public. It's a really interesting, phenomenal resource in Buffalo, especially for architects. So through these kinds of small-scale interventions, we're interested in an idea of introducing habitats as artifices in settings where you might not necessarily expect to see them. And so we conceived of this next project, Bat Cloud, as basically a floating cloud in the trees, something that you might encounter while you're taking a walk in the woods maybe, or on a nature trail. From afar, it appears like a floating mass. And up close, you can see that it's comprised of a series of habitation pods. Each pod consists of a bat habitation area above. Let me see if we can kind of bat habitation area above in this zone, and then a kind of planting area below. So it's a kind of area that's filled with soil and vegetation. So here's a view of the kind of project from above. It's conceived of as a self-sustaining system. So if they're occupied, for example, then the guano from the bats would kind of filter down into the plant area, fertilize the plants, et cetera. So that's the kind of idea of that system anyway. And like the Bat Tower, this project was first a siteless prototype. We were fortunate, though, to have been selected by the UB Humanities Institute, which is an organization in the university, for a program called Fluid Culture. And through this initiative, they connected us with Tift Nature Preserve as a site and as a partner in Buffalo. So here's some photos of Tift Nature Preserve. This is a site that was actually formerly the city's garbage dump in the 1950s and 60s. And in 1972, it was created as a preserve. And now it's managed by the Buffalo Museum of Science. It's right in the middle of an industrial zone in the city, right? I mean, this looks like some kind of nature trail or something, but it's right in the middle of an industrial zone. And so it's quite an interesting location. On Tift, we used a number of trees, 5 trees, to anchor a series of cables, and then we designed the vessels to hang in clusters from these cables. The fabrication of this process, or of this project, also took place in-house, and it was done through relatively modest means. And the construction of each pod, you can see here, is comprised of 3 different pieces of stainless steel mesh, which have been folded to increase rigidity and then bolted together. So the vessels were all prefabricated off-site, driven to Tift, along with several ladders and a bunch of hand tools, and thankfully, due to the nice weather in Buffalo at that time, and also an amazing team, we were able to put the project up in less than 12 hours. One of the issues that we've been working with in this project has to do with thermal insulation. And so from our previous experience, we've learned that bats tend to need relatively stable and warm environments. And this is one of the reasons why bats occupy attics and indoor spaces. And we also realized after building the Bat Tower that project worked well in the summer, but it was not warm enough in the winter. Even though it was absorbing sunlight and all these things, it wasn't warm enough for bats in the winter. So for the Bat Cloud project, we were interested in making kind of insulated space above and testing out to see how it works if you were to insert a warm body into the space to see whether it would retain the heat. So in this kind of makeshift experiment, we heated up one of those kind of little gel packs and put it inside, and then took photos of this with a thermal camera. And you can see that, oops, sorry, I'm going to go back. You can see that that the pod basically operates very similarly to my jacket. It's kind of keeping the heat in, and it works much better than the sweater here. Okay, so we're doing another iteration of this project for an installation in Rotterdam now. And for this next installation, we've been experimenting with kind of tweaking the design a little bit. And one of the things that we've been working on is looking at different layers of material that can not just keep heat in, but also absorb heat. So you can see the back, so this is Joyce Hwang, who's been working with me on this. You can see all this kind of, we bought a whole bunch of plastic pool covering in the, you can see back here, which we've been like layering up to try to make these insulated conditions. And here we are setting up our makeshift experiment again, putting the thermal camera inside the pod to see, how long it would retain the heat, subjecting the pod to a heat lamp, etc. And here are some images showing the kind of heat capacity of the pod after putting it under a heat lamp. And ideally, we would have tested this in the summer in Buffalo, but it was winter, so we had to buy a heat lamp since the sun isn't really out that often. Okay, so this is a project that's provoked a number of reactions. The perceptual effects of of the bat cloud's materials render it as an unexpected encounter in the woods or in the nature preserve. And this is something that seemed to have caught the attention of the local population. So since its installation, I've been contacted by a range of people in the Buffalo area with questions such as, how do I get a bat out of my house? To, could I not sell them some of these pods? Or I also received emails from several Boy Scouts saying that they wanted to build bat houses for their Eagle Scout project. And so there's a kind of ongoing list of kind of interesting inquiries about the project. And in the grand scheme of cities and regions, I think projects such as Bat Tower, Habitat Wall, and Bat Cloud are small, but they're also able to instigate curiosity, I think, at a much larger scale. And so I'm interested in thinking about their potential, not just as isolated moments, but also as something that can be deployed within a larger urban system. So this is a map of South Buffalo. This kind of green area in the margin is the site where Bat Cloud is. But as I mentioned before, this is an area, a kind of industrial area of Buffalo with a lot of vacant land, formerly industrial land. And these are some of the buildings, some of the abandoned grain silos and such within this whole landscape. It's a pretty interesting landscape. The buildings, all the kind of old grain silos and such in this region already in many cases serve as habitats for certain animals. So how might one begin to even take advantage of this as an existing condition? So again, starting with the current condition today, an industrial landscape with a lot of vacant property, what if we think about them not only as empty space, but also as potentially productive landscapes, areas that can provide habitats for urban wildlife and vegetation. So if the bigger goal is to create conditions for species to thrive in cities, then we have to think about these small-scale interventions not as end products, but rather as a way to instigate the beginning of a series or a trajectory of interventions. So then the question becomes, how do you produce an aggregation of effects within a larger territory? So thinking about the potential to produce these larger social and ecological effects, we became interested in ways that we could look at urban regulatory structures, such as zoning, and thinking about ways to mine them. Here's a portion, a kind of snapshot of a small part of the City of Buffalo zoning map. And currently, the city's undergoing a major zoning overhaul. The new framework is called the Buffalo Green Code. The research project I'm about to talk about really is not explicitly related to that effort, but instead it's more about thinking about the potential of mining the city's existing outdated code and thinking about what one could do in that interim period of transition. So you can see in this redrawn zoning map that Buffalo is a city that's filled with a lot of parks, conservation areas, green spaces, and many of you, especially those of you who are here from Buffalo, do know that Olmsted, the park system is an Olmsted park system, parks and parkway system. But aside from some of these green spaces, there aren't a lot of, let's say, mechanisms for introducing kind of green threads through the city, aside from the Olmsted Parkway system. So the research project which we started, which is titled Generative Zoning, looks to find opportunities within the zoning system to combat habitat fragmentation and to promote a more continuous system for animals in the city. And so we received a grant from the Baldy Center for Law and Social Policy to take on this project. And one of the first challenges was simply just to visualize the code, which in its current state is difficult to comprehend. And there's a lot of complex legal language. And so we began by graphically representing standard form-based codes such as setbacks. And we quickly became aware or started looking more at the long list of permitted uses in Buffalo, which we analyzed in this diagram. And what you can see here is that there's a nested system. I'll zoom in a little bit closer. So in Buffalo, there's a nested system of permitted uses. So any use that's within R1 residential, for example, also exists within R2 residential, also exists within R3, and it kind of goes out to commercial and industrial. And so we started looking at these conditions and marking out specific patterns that were occurring within the system of permitted uses. Something that we realized, which we marked in green, is that any place where there's a residential zone abutting a manufacturing zone calls for a 50 to 100-foot setback. And those of you, since you all live here, know that that's basically half of a block in Manhattan. So we thought that this was interesting, that there are some areas that require a 100-foot setback in their program. And so we started to look at some of those boundary conditions, and this is what we found. So we looked at areas where residential abuts manufacturing. We found these kind of very large spaces. Here's, so this is what Buffalo's looking like these days. And so, again, like residential and manufacturing abutting, you get these kind of very large spaces that typically get turned into parking lots and such. And, you can see some efforts by the local community trying to liven up that fence, but really this is just a giant parking lot. And then, so what happens in some of these very large setbacks, you get they're unplanned places. There's just a lot of debris and stuff accumulating in them. Anyway, so then we thought, okay, well, what if we looked at all of those boundary conditions between manufacturing and residential areas and we highlighted them? What would that produce? Because those are all spaces that have these kind of very large setbacks. And if we started to continue or to make them continuous, connect them through vacant spaces and through green areas, could we not start to create a much more continuous green infrastructure in the city? So these are kind of zooming into some areas, some of those kind of more intense areas on that map. Okay, another condition that we noticed is marked in blue here. And what that condition is that there are certain types of program that require perimeter wall of 6 feet high around the property, or they require that that a building face is completely enclosed, or that it only contains stationary windows or no windows at all. And the programs include things like manufacturing plants, auto repair shops, kennels, storage facilities, even pool halls and bowling alleys, amazingly. And so these, in my mind, I think are opportunities where one could propose and promote ideas for wall-based habitat infrastructures as a viable means for thinking about zoning not just as restrictions, but also putting forward some new ideas, thinking about kind of a way to take this on creatively. So, well, I mentioned earlier that the implementation of small-scale work has piqued interest in the community and the larger public. And certainly the idea of consciousness raising has been a big part of our agenda. We've also been very interested in the production of material interventions that can instigate action at multiple levels, such as forming collaborations with others, with alliances, engaging in interdisciplinary work, and organizations with looking at further research. So, for example, throughout the process of developing my most recent work, I formed a loose collaboration with the biologist Katarina Dittmar, who's a faculty member at the University of Buffalo. And she began as a kind of consultant for the Bat Tower project and advised us on many things like selecting the site and also thinking about the spaces and the textures of the tower itself. It's an interesting experience to go on a walk with biologists and ecologists. So while you as an architect are looking at space, material, light, and details, they're looking at animal droppings. Or in this case, well, actually, you can see that, I mean, they've basically discovered just by looking at the droppings on the ground here that there was this bird's nest up here, which we didn't even realize. But in any case, in this case, they were fascinated by this decomposing deer that we found in all this building debris. So from this relationship, we've developed several initiatives. First, we're thinking about ways of using architectural products as part of an ongoing science experiment, or series of science experiments. And Katarina has taken one of the bat cloud vessels with her to her research station in Puerto Rico to monitor activity and also to monitor changes in temperature, humidity over time, which are primary concerns for habitats. And this has promoted us, or prompted us to initiate a bunch of other studies like these makeshift experiments that I showed you earlier with the thermal camera. So we're also discussing different ideas about how to better or how to more productively engage the urban landscape in Buffalo, thinking about the issue of urban habitat fragmentation that I mentioned. And she's also been talking with me about the Generative Zoning project and what its implications might be. So in the past couple of years, I've worked more intensely to advocate for an agenda of rethinking what I call urban wilderness. And as an educator, I bring these issues into the teaching and research environment. So over the past 2 years, I've asked students to research the role and place of urban species and consider ways of spatializing their presence. This is a project by a student, Matt Ryberg, who was proposing the use of discarded pallets and tennis balls to create habitats for mice. And the intention was to draw them away from a nearby residential zone where the mice weren't welcome. This is a project by student Tim Gargiulo that considers the typology of the skyscraper to accommodate large birds of prey, such as falcons. And in the context of these studios, Katerina has been a really important advisor and a collaborator. In 2012, I organized a competition in Buffalo for students to propose a new bee habitat and this was a project to basically move this super large existing hive from a building that was slated for renovation to make a new installation that would house this bee colony. This was an effort that was co-coordinated with other faculty members at the University of Buffalo's Ecological Practices Research Group, Martha Baum and Chris Romano. And together we developed the Hive City Bee Habitat Competition, which brought in around 40 students competing. And so after a series of rounds of competition, the winning project was Elevator B, which was designed and built pretty much by the student team with some advisement from faculty, structural engineers, and beekeepers. The students involved in this project were Courtney Creenan, Kyle Mastelinski, Dan Need, Scott Seelan, and Lisa Stern. The sponsor of this project was Rick Smith of Rigidized Metals, which is a metal manufacturing company in Buffalo, and also the owner of the site. The site, by the way, itself has become known as Silo City. It's a large piece of formerly industrial land with grain silos all over it. It was vacant for a while. Rigidized Metals purchased this land, and now it's being repurposed as a site for different events and installations. So before I talked a bit about the public perception of wildlife and how it changes when projects are implemented, and I think what's been interesting here with the organization of the Hive City competition is how it shifted some public opinion on the usefulness of constructing habitats. So before the project was built, there was an article published in the Buffalo News about this project, and the comments that followed the article, so before it was built, were how in any way is a beehive on someone's private property in any way going to help downtown Buffalo or the waterfront? Sounds ridiculous. Why do we want more bees downtown? To drive the last 3 tourists out? Build something useful on the land that everyone can use. Or I don't know what to say, the waterfront ideas presented each week get increasingly worse. Next week we'll read that some other fringe group has decided to plant 14 acres of poison ivy on the waterfront and water it with recycled wastewater from the city. So this is the kind of thing that you're getting before the project is built. And so after it was built, it started receiving a lot of popular press. It started getting a lot of attention. Here's a couple of examples, one from Fast Company and from Wired. So I think this shift in attitude and attention, just in terms of realizing a project, however small it is quite interesting. And so our aims in instigating action among students, architects, and the public are twofold. First, we're interested in exploring new models of practice. And in our work, I would say it's been very difficult to find organizations outside of the university or arts grants that are interested enough to sponsor the work right away. And certainly saying that you're developing architecture for animals doesn't lead to any lucrative commissions. And even among parties that are generally interested in what we're doing, such as farming groups, bat conservation groups, anti-pesticide organizations, it's been hard to get funding up front, although they've been quite helpful in other ways. So usually in our process, the design efforts will begin before any other support rolls in. And you can see here that The support is typically from educational and arts organizations. So working in this way, I think, also addresses, for me, a bigger discussion about whether or how even architecture can move beyond its status as a service industry toward an understanding of it as a tool for advocacy. And in this process, the organization of the practice is then quite dynamic. So there's a need to be nimble, to be flexible due to the unpredictability of funding and other issues. So the number of people involved in the projects and at every phase change depending on the circumstances and also the resources. Okay, so the second aim of instigating action among students, architects, and the public is that we're interested in impressing upon architects and the public that the consideration of urban animals should not be necessarily a niche interest in our field, since occupation by animals is in some way actually a kind of default condition in cities. So I'm interested in thinking about how these issues can directly impact the core of our discipline. So for example, if you think about the notion of ornament, this is the pantheon actually, it's possible that facade articulation, which we typically associate with proportioning systems and style, would take on more responsibilities. And maybe ornament, will start to become more performative in supporting species. So instead of finding bird deterrent spikes on buildings, we might find cornices and other facade articulation that are enhanced and enlarged to welcome bird perching and nesting. And this is the Ponte Roto in Rome. We could also think about adaptive reuse differently. So we could develop a range of strategies that use existing buildings and structures in cities. Maybe they could take on a wider variety of implications. So as we know, buildings are already a form of shelter for many forms of urban wildlife, so how can we capitalize on what they're already doing? And how can we also rethink the idea of urban maintenance? So when we think of property maintenance today, we think of lawn mowing, tree trimming, street cleaning, and garbage disposal. And further embedded in that is an idea of, chemical processes and fumigation. We tend to forget, though, that animals themselves also provide a form of ecosystem services for our cities. So bats eating mosquitoes, spiders eating other insects, or stray cats eating rats. So how do we consider the landscape as something that's much more wild, much more varied, and an environment that would allow many species to inhabit? So in recognizing that animals serve as a significant form of urban maintenance, we're also advocating for an architecture that embraces the potential that might come out of these relationships. What can animals do? And maybe you can think about the spider web as a nuisance on the one hand. You might think of it as disgusting, but also consider this moment in 2010 when, after a massive flood in Pakistan, when spiders ran up into these trees and started weaving these enormous kind of spider tree webs, which I think are actually quite stunning, and also apparently relieved the town of mosquitoes for momentarily. So as architects, I think we need to first recognize the potential of unexpected situations in the ecological world and their consequences, and think about them both spatially and performatively. So we often hear about the performative value of organisms, but I think we won't actually be able to take advantage of them until we actually overcome our fear and loathing of pests. And so, for example, consider that scientists in North Carolina State University are experimenting with cockroaches, outfitting them to find trapped earthquake victims. And while this is seen as a major step forward in the world of search and rescue operations, it's still being met with squeamish comments, such as one I read in a paper in the Huffington Post, where someone commented on this and said, "I'd rather die under a collapsed building than be approached by a roach." Yes, indeed. So, finally we'll reach a point when we as architects will need to grapple with ethical dimensions of including and instrumentalizing animals as part of our ecosystem. As animals begin to occupy a more visible place in the conception and construction of urban environments, we will need to revisit the question of how we're defining the limits between our world and their world. How do we define the limits between our world and that of the other? And so as we begin scripting them into our plans for buildings and cities, how will we now consider their value in terms, not only in terms of performance and aesthetics, but also as sentient forms of life? So in the pursuit of cross-species design, we will ultimately need to grapple, I think, with more ethically difficult questions that challenge the ways that we fundamentally think about our own values, not only in terms of design, but also in terms of life itself. Thank you.